Hello, everyone. We will begin shortly, and in the meantime, please put your name and where you're joining us from today in the chat below. Welcome, everyone. I will be starting shortly. In the meantime, please put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat below. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another CMS in Touch event. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome wherever you're joining us from around the world. So this is our second event in our Hot of the Press series. And in this series, we bring you inspiring conversations with authors and editors of recently published cutting-edge critical work. So sit back, enjoy. We have an hour and a half today, and there'll be opportunities for questions and discussions towards the end. And in the meantime, do feel free to, if you have any questions as we go along, do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Don't put them in the chat, put them in Q&A, and we'll make sure that the presenters get them when it comes to the discussion. So on this note, and without further ado, I'm delighted to pass you into the capable hands of our organizers, Ilaria, Emmanouela, and Amal. Enjoy, and we're going to be talking about a really exciting book authored by Ilaria on researching and writing differently. So over to you, Ilaria.
Thank you, and thank you so much for joining us today. The last time I checked, we had over 140 attendees from all over the world. So I'm really humbled by the response that the event has had. Also, many thanks to Alex and the CMS in Touch team for inviting me to deliver this webinar, but also for supporting the webinar so well. And then super special thanks to my colleagues who are joining me today and friends with whom I've worked a lot over the past 3 years. Dr. Amal Abdellatif, who is a lecturer at Northumbria University in the UK. She finished her PhD last year, and she's in her first lecturing post after PhD. So she is one of the examples of the audience I wrote this book for. And my other colleague, Dr. Emmanouela Mandalki, and she's an associate professor at Lyon Business School in France. And she is, again, a prime example of one of the colleagues I was thinking of when writing this book. So this is what the book looks like, which is this in real life. It was published in December 2022 by Bristol University Press, which is also known as Policy Press. And knowing how prohibitive the cost of academic books is in the UK, the publisher wanted me to share a discount code today for anyone who's interested in purchasing the book. The discount code is Research50 for 50% off, and it's valid for a week from today. The book is available in print and also as an ebook. So I hope you get a chance to see in a library, perhaps, or to have your own copy. I was asked to think a little bit about, not just about the book, but how I came to write this book. And I had written a previous monograph and edited books and book chapters and journal articles, but I wasn't planning on writing this book at all. So in 2019, I attended the International Critical Management Studies Conference, which at the time I think was in Milton Keynes at the Open University. And it was the first conference after my baby was born, my social anxiety was through the roof, and I got there really, really early, as I usually do. And people were setting up publisher stands, and I was looking through books, and this wonderful stand at Bristol University Press had some amazing books about social justice and women's work. And I started chatting to a very friendly, smiley face, Paul Stevens, and we talked about books and writing differently. And I said to him, you know, he asked me whether I was perhaps thinking of writing another book. And I said, no, not really. I don't think I have a book in me right now. And he kind of elicited it out of me for the, you know, in the next couple of months. So he said, oh, you don't need to send me a full proposal. Why don't you just write a paragraph or so about what you might be interested in writing about? And so this is how the book came along. So it was commissioned on an idea, whilst my previous monograph was, you know, already written before I approached publishers. So this was a little bit scary for me, because it was, I signed the contract to start working on this on the 1st of March 2020. And as many of you will remember, especially those who work in the UK, March 2020 is when the UK went into COVID lockdown. And at the time, so I had a small child, and I also had started a big job as a faculty dean with lots of responsibilities. And because of COVID, we had to rethink all our delivery across 7 departments, reapprove anything that needed to be delivered, or, you know, any assessments. So at the beginning, work on this book was delayed. So I had to prioritize on other work. And then I really started having a little bit of self-doubt and kind of like feeding my imposter syndrome, thinking, with the COVID and everything, I don't know if I have much to say. I don't know if people will think this is interesting or important. And then I just started writing as it usually does. It just kind of like became a flow of thoughts and emotion and everything else. And I know that usually people thank colleagues and friends at the end of the presentation, but I want to do it at the beginning, because there are some colleagues who, in the middle of a global pandemic, were so kind and provided feedback on the very first draft of the manuscript. And obviously the manuscript now looks a little bit different, but Monica Costera, Sergio Shia, Astrid Hopalainen, Norte van Amsterdam, and Emmanouela Mandalki, who's here today with us, they were so kind and so critical, friendly in their feedback that really, really made a difference. The book then went into the publisher as a full manuscript and went on to reviewers, and then we did some revisions, and then finally it became what it is today. And I am also really thankful that Professor Sarah Gilmore has written a lovely review of my book and Monica Costera's latest book on how to write differently, which will be out in the journal Organization Studies. So this is how it all started. The audience I had in mind was quite varied. So the first kind of like group of colleagues I thought of was PhD students and early career scholars. And this is because my journey towards researching and writing differently has been long and also quite isolated at the beginning. So I thought these are all the things that I would have liked to tell my old self, you know, my younger early career self. But also I thought it would be great to engage with this growing community about writing differently. And so you can see that, you know, these first two audiences really mirror Amal and Emmanouela, whom I invited to join me today. Again, people interested in critical perspectives on researching and writing differently, and contemporary academic practices. And I should say that obviously this work stems from my interdisciplinary background, and it's located in management and organization studies, because I'm a professor in management and marketing at the University of Essex and a dean. So even though it is located in management organization studies, it's also really informed by interdisciplinary approaches. And for example, I have been invited to deliver an 11-week course based on this book for a doctoral group of students in Italy. And so I'm now in week 8 of 11 of this delivery, and it has been a lot of fun. And the students are from media studies, philosophy, law, management, marketing. So this can really be applicable to lots of different things, because it, as we will see, is not really just about this field. So this is what the contents page look like. The book is divided into 3 parts, and I will talk you briefly through these different areas. I will just pick out some key points that I think are relevant for today. And obviously, as you can imagine, there is a lot more in the book to explore. So the first part is really to contextualize this book. So I've had experience of Italy, China, and the UK as kind of like an academic and educational context. And so this is particularly true of the UK. However, this neoliberal academic environment is increasingly pervasive. And what neoliberal academia means is that the university is really run as a business. So it's premised on kind of like economic commercial principles. And so we are asked increasingly to produce more, higher quality, better, faster. And so the way we work in the UK academic context today is very different from what our colleagues might have experienced 30 years ago, or even what I experienced about 20 years ago. So nowadays, the quality of research is very much often quantified in terms of, rankings and metrics of, citation indexes and, how many stars are allocated to publications and so on. So this is also really fueling individualism, competition, for example, for funding or for academic posts. And in many cases also exclusion, because academia, like most organizations, is not, organizational context and systems is not a neutral place. Obviously, it's a place of kind of like lots of different intersecting dynamics of power. So I provide like an introduction to neoliberal academia, about its different aspects, and also theoretically I build on Monica Costera's book, wonderful book, After the Apocalypse. And I locate researching and writing differently as kind of like a nascent, the beginnings of how we can perhaps move beyond this. So the book is called Researching and Writing Differently, rather than just Writing Differently, which is the kind of like the way lots of work has been labeled nowadays in my field, because I think that thinking, researching, reading, writing, and being in academia is all part of one inextricable way of approaching academia, being an academic, and the work we do. So I further locate the book within critical and feminist perspectives. I'm a critical management scholar, and I'm definitely a feminist, and I think there are lots of things in common between these two approaches. So first of all, in both cases, we look at power dynamics and inclusion and exclusions and dynamics of privilege and obsession. In the case of feminist thought, contemporary feminist thought, we look at flourishing for all. So obviously feminism is about women's rights, but it's not just about women's rights. And so it's looking at flourishing for everyone, for every human being, and also perhaps non-human beings. The researching and writing differently is also focused on the listening to and the amplifying of marginalized voices, looking at who is in the center of discussions or privilege and who is marginalized. We also look at intersectional and interdisciplinary approaches to researching and writing. And something that is both common to critical perspectives and feminist perspectives is the reimagining of alternatives and futures. So not just a critique of the status quo and a challenge of inequality, but also a reimagining of future possibilities. And feminist perspectives, of course, are rooted in feminist ethics of care and caring approaches that I'll discuss later. So this is not something new per se, although it's very topical. There is a lot about researching and writing differently ante litteram, so before we labeled it in this way. So for example, the work of Professor Heather Hoffel, who was my supervisor as a doctoral student and a colleague, can fit quite, prominently in this field. As you will see, if you get a chance to look at the book, there is about 35 or 40 pages of reference list. And you will see that many of these sources are kind of beyond the label of researching and writing differently, because I wanted to collect my favorite sources and my favorite research and studies that are either explicitly part of writing differently and researching differently, or aligned with it. And so it's not supposed to be an exhaustive list, of course, and it's not a literature reviewer per se, but I thought it would be a good starting point for anyone who's interested in researching and writing differently. In 2006, Gray and Sinclair wrote an article that really kind of like propelled this writing differently way of doing research. And then in 2016, I attended a strand on writing differently at the Gender Working Organization conference. And that resulted into a special issue, wonderful special issue in management learning, edited by Sarah Gilmore, Nancy Harding, Jenny Helling, and Alison Pullen. I was very, very lucky and really privileged to have an article co-authored with Charlie Smith in that special issue. And that was really the start of my adventure within researching and writing differently. But also there have been lots of workshops and writing retreats and PDW's professional development workshops in conferences, for example, even at the Academy of Management in 2021, that have fostered this type of work and kind of like given it visibility and fostered collaborations. And then there are two edited collections about researching and writing differently, which are wonderful. One edited by Alison Pullen, Jenny Helling, and Nancy Harding, and a more recent one edited by Monica Costera. And if you haven't already done so, I would definitely recommend reading both. So you will probably think that researching and writing differently kind of has an inherent comparative within it. So different from what? So my field of management and organization studies has a very kind of masculine normative view of what research is and how it should be conducted. And traditionally, it's a very normative, environment. And so different from these mainstream approaches to researching and writing, different from masculine, not male, approaches to research, although masculine and male are very often together in this field. It's also against the discriminating and exclusionary practice and othering in academia. And it's kind of like challenging and questioning who can speak and for whom as researchers and participants and editors and reviewers. It is also against a careless kind of approach to academic work and academic being, and more towards ethics of care. And it's an openness to different styles, language, topics, focus, experience, and different ways of researching and being in academia. So in terms of the content of researching and writing differently and what it is, it can mean a lot of different things now. It can be a movement or like a political choice about how we write, with whom and what, for example. It can be a way of being and researching more collaboratively with others. It can also mean giving exposure and exploring topics that are silenced or belittled or ignored in our field. It can also be highlighting different perspectives, different power dynamics, points of privilege, dynamics of privilege. And as I said before, this kind of like spaces of power, who is in the center, who is privileged, who is marginalized, and why. It also looks at depth of experience. So I am mostly a qualitative researcher, although I do use some quantitative methods in other work, and I am really interested in depth of experience. And I put here this kind of like blue marble-like picture. I don't know if you've seen them before. They're called stereograms. And this type of picture, you're required to look at it in a different way in order to see the hidden picture. So this to me is a very good metaphor for researching and writing differently, in trying to approach things in a different way, from a different perspective. And then I've included the picture below with some snails from my garden. And this picture was taken by my first child, Livia. And when she showed it to me, I said, oh, that's lovely. It's a snail on one of our flowers. It's, maybe she's suntanning. And she said, no, Mummy, it's a snail with a baby. And I hadn't seen the baby. But maybe because she was a baby at the time, she focused not on the, the main character, the big snail, but on the little snail. And so it's also acknowledging the perspective of different people, different groups. And it's also acknowledging that, like in the magnolia picture, there is really, it's really important to look not only at what is in the frame, but also what is left outside of the frame. So what is it that we're not focusing on? What is it that we are consciously or unconsciously neglecting? So I'm really interested in the micro level of experience, so individuals, in organizations, or in processes of organizing, and how the personal experience is related to the more, the broader, more universal experience. And then again, writing differently and researching differently is also very often using different structures or genres or registers, style, compared to the more traditional way of researching and writing. So in the book, in the second part, I look at some key things that have been explored through researching and writing differently. First of all, embodiment and affect. So traditionally in my field, there is this idea of the ideal worker who is like unencumbered, detached, disembodied, able-bodied, male, cisgender, white. That is kind of like the ideal worker, which obviously is not ideal per se, but is what others have been othered against and compared with. And there is also the idea of the ideal scientist in academia, which is mirroring the ideal worker. For example, not taking into account individual intersections in terms of identity or particular needs or different types of experiences and contexts. So my field is really kind of silencing, but also undermining the leaky, messy, dirty, and unruly bodies that go against linear and neat understandings of who people are, how they inhabit organizations, how life and work interacts, and so on. And this is because it's easier to manage people thinking that one size can fit all, but that never happens. One size never fits all. So, in the way we think of organizations and organizing principles, leaky, messy understandings of life and work are more challenging. And when they don't play to the strengths of the majority, then they are very often silenced. So here in researching and writing differently, we instead really trust affective and embodied knowing. So we reject the fact that, cognitive intellectual knowing needs to be prioritized over affective and embodied knowing. And there is an increasing body of work around this in management organization studies, for example, around maternity and breastfeeding, North of Amsterdam, and then Charlie and I wrote on miscarriage, and Saoirse wrote on transgender and gender non-conforming experiences. And so these more embodied and affective processes are also illuminated through this type of research that doesn't usually fit within the mainstream. The other thing to think about is that affect can be a noun, but also a verb in English. And so it can also mean to affect. And in this kind of like linguistic exception, then you can see how affect and also embodiment are highly relational. And there is a dialogue between the person and others. There is also a movement of affect and bodies that we'll see in a minute. And so this is really to highlight the importance of emotions in organizations and organizing. Two other key themes that are explored together in the book are around time and movement. And I look at aspects of time, like in the practicalities of doing research, but also how we engage in dialogues across time. So for example, when we look at an article, or even here in the slides, you will see that you have references dotted across, you know, decades and sometimes even centuries. And so we are interweaving time within our discourse, but also there is different aspects of time, of when we write alone, when we write together, when we engage with literature review, when we review and revise. But there is also the time of a paper. There is like through punctuation, or the way we write, or the type of text we choose to use, like if it's, for example, poetry or autoethnography or a different type of prose, then there is a time of the paper as well. There is also a timeline of publication, of writing a paper, of when it comes out to the world. And for example, this book, I started writing it towards the end of 2020, and it was published towards the end of 2022. So, you know, the life of this, the generative part of this book has been almost 2 years. And then Jenny Helling, whose work is absolutely fundamental for researching and writing differently. I know I sound a little bit like a groupie, but I kind of am. She encourages us to write vertically. And I think this really brings together both time and movement of research. So to write within ourselves and going up. And so there's a movement between digging up and down within our own experience, in our writing, and how we can touch what's most important within us, the most sensitive, but also kind of like put it in externally and how we touch others. And this very much resonates with the theme of movement and its relationality, and how through this type of research we can encounter otherness as alterity. So embracing difference, embracing what we don't know, rather than treating it as something that is othered and needs to be marginalized. So there is also some reflection in the book around the spaces and places of research, and thinking, for example, drawing from Goffman's theatrical metaphor of, you know, all the things that we do as academics or people or organization members that are in the front stage and the backstage, and how we do things that are, you know, hidden and things that are more performative and public. There is also thought around the movement of the text. So Emmanouela, Mandalki and Mas Perez's paper, It Takes Two to Tango, is a lovely paper that I had the privilege to be a reviewer for. And you can see how, if you literally look at the article, the text is dancing on the article. And so that is kind of like movement on the page about a tango experience as a method. So so you can look at movement both kind of like literally and metaphorically. And then obviously there is a lot of research on literal movement and experiences of movement, like dance, for example. So one thing that I also mention in the book is vulnerability and risk, because this type of research, especially when it's linked to autoethnography or evocative writing or, sensitive topics, like when I wrote about my experience of miscarriage, then it can be very vulnerable, because honesty is a prerogative of this type of writing. And vulnerability, kind of like the etymology, comes from Latin vulnus, and it's a wound inflicted from an external source, and then able, suggesting openness and some positive aspects. So there is an ambiguity within the concept of vulnerability. And whilst in management organization studies, traditionally vulnerability has been seen as something negative, something that we have to hide, something that is not, for example, a characteristic of a leader or a successful manager, that you have to fake it till you make it. Researching and Writing Differently does not espouse this view, and it espouses vulnerability as Janet Johansson and Alec Wistrom say, like, it's a different type of strength. And although it can have negative aspects, it doesn't mean that it is a marginalizing condition in itself. So it can be understood as a different epistemological position, where vulnerability is openness towards this relations with the outside, and relationships can mean that one is hurt or not, and it can mean an openness to not just to stick to what we know and our authorial voice and kind of like our knowledge, but it's also openness to difference and not knowing and undoing and not being in control. And so embracing difference and the unknowing is an integral part to me of researching and writing differently. So as I mentioned, risk is another topic. It's another key topic within researching and writing differently, because with this vulnerability also comes an exposure. And as Alison Pullen says, writing exposes, and with exposure, we get cast in a sea of risk, insecurity, and vulnerability. And this is echoed in Brown's work. So it is really important that we acknowledge the risks of researching and writing differently, in the fact that vulnerability in writing and in what we decide to share with the world might mean exposure, might mean that, because our work is not in the mainstream area of our field, then it might not get published as much or cited as much, or we might reveal aspects of how we are and who we are and what we do that might, mean that others, criticize us for it, or we're ridiculed for it, or cast away. So there is a lot of very amazing, open, honest, vulnerable writing nowadays in management organization studies, and I have included some of those studies here. The last part of the book focuses on methods and processes. So I locate this part of the book within qualitative inquiry. Not that there isn't anything wrong with quantitative inquiry, but researching and writing differently is really, I think, enhanced through qualitative inquiry and autoethnography, ethnography more broadly, and also arts-based methods. So narrative methods, visual methods, sensory methods, and performative methods. And these are also a way of moving away from this rigid, very normative, codified ways of understanding research and how we need to talk about it. So, for example, by using poetry or visual methods, we allow affect and embodiment to reach audiences in a way that is not kind of encapsulated in technical jargon, academic language. I also discussed feminist and inclusive approaches to data and citation practices, because although very often these kind of like extra processes of academic researching and writing are left in the margins and they're thought of as objective and neutral, they are not objective and neutral. And so I thought it would be good to have a reflection on the dynamics behind these processes. I also very much include practical aspects of researching and writing differently, which very often are the things that my doctoral students are most interested in, because when I started in my academic career, nobody told me about these things, and it took me a long time to navigate all this kind of like taken for granted academic knowledge of you know, how to engage with things. And, you know, for example, issues around failure and the fact that, you know, failure is what is considered failure is part of academic work. We all go through it. We continue to go through it through our career. And, you know, we very often only see the successful outputs or the success stories, but actually researching and writing differently also means sharing the not so successful attempts. It's really important. It was really important for me and absolutely life-changing to find my tribe, as I say. So to find a community of people who are interested in researching and writing differently, and with whom I can exchange ideas, even, you know, even critical ideas, you know, just to explore this world with others. I also talk about how you can write together, and this is how I met Amal. She invited me to write together on a project where she was first author, and she so beautifully led a group of academics across all hierarchical levels, you know, of our careers. As a PhD student, she did an amazing job, and I learned a lot from that experience. And also kind of like more practical aspects of doing research and writing differently for doctoral students in particular. And Ruth Weatherall and Leila Jamjoon have two beautiful pieces on this that reflect on their own experience as doctoral students. So this is really a quick overview of the book and its contents. And now I would like to ask Amal and Emmanouela to join me for a little discussion about some aspects that they found more relevant or interesting of the book, or some questions about it before we open the floor to our colleagues in the chat. Amal, do you want to get us started?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone for being here today. And I really enjoyed I always enjoyed your work, and I'm so privileged to be here today. Thank you as well for sharing your insightful presentation and your inspiring work. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, especially as a PhD student who just finished. I still feel I'm a PhD student, but I just finished last year as an early career researcher. It really touched me a lot and spoke to me a lot, particularly in positioning writing and researching differently as a form of a political and feminist project, one that focuses on relational and intersectional reflexivity to ensure that we make visible the inequalities at the different intersection of difference. It also inspired me on how to think about bringing forth concepts of embodied writing, vulnerability, ethics of care, and creating a caring communities. I'm so privileged to be part of this and to find, as you said, as you always told me, try to find your tribe. I am so glad that I'm on the journey of finding this tribe, and part of this tribe is you and Emmanouela and many of the people attending today, actually. So it helped me focus or think and rethink about considering concept of embodied writing, vulnerability, and affects, emotions, and how can we use and implement these concepts in our writing to subvert the patriarchal and distance way of doing research about organization and writing in an academic way. My question is, and this is stemming from my personality and my position now as an early career researcher, and my personality as someone who always have conflicting thought about conforming to the norms of writing, and at the same time, how can I subvert this? How can I challenge this? How can I resist this? So I was just wondering, how can we as early career researchers or PhD students build the confidence, or as you say in the part 2 of your book, how can we dare to write and research differently against the metricized, the sanitized, or the disembodied mainstream organization academic writing and research? And how can we write again in the new liberal academic writing norms of what is considered a proper research, what's considered to be a rigorous academic writing? And that would be great to share your advice on this. Thank you.
Thank you. A really important question, and I'll see what Emmanouela thinks in her own experience in a minute. So, as I mentioned, it took me a long time to get to this researching and writing, even to the start of that journey. And I think my supervisor had suggested this approach, but I didn't understand it when she suggested it. So it took me a long time to understand which type of academic I wanted to be and what type of work I wanted to do. And although not everything I do in terms of research is written differently, the way I research now is a different approach to the way I used to do it before. As an early career scholar, so I love examining PhDs because, you know, it's such a privilege to be part of that first academic experience of a student. And I know that very often at the beginning, students kind of like do maybe a little bit of data collection or data presentation or in terms of writing differently, and the other work a bit more kind of like in a traditional way. And that's what I did as well. So, you know, not all work needs to be, you know, written differently. But I think what is really, what has made a difference for me is really, you know, finding that community that can help you understand and inhabit that space. So whether it's like attending conferences, or, you know, some sessions or workshops, or, you know, development opportunities. And I think you, Amal, are like the prime example of how to engage with this. And, you know, looking for mentoring opportunities, looking for, you know, making those connections with people that you think actually, you know, we both espouse this approach, and let's see if we can, you know, learn from each other, or even work together formally, or, you know, just have conversations around this, because I think it takes a long time to navigate this. And, you know, and I think sometimes depending on the stages of your career, you also have to fulfill some, you know, requirements for your probation or your promotion, or, you know, so I think it might change at different stages of your career, and also as you find your voice and your confidence. Emmanouela, what do you think?
First of all, thank you very much, Ilaria, for inviting me to that panel discussion, and Amal as well for being here. It's again a pleasure to share that space with both of you and with the organizers, with the whole audience. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. It has been a pleasure to read your book and to be trusted to give friendly feedback to that last year or 2 years ago when you were already writing it or preparing it. So thank you so much for that trust. I have always enjoyed reading your work, and also because it brings in a certain autoethnographic element, which also shows actually how you were brought to write that book, which I think is important. Also, when it comes to the question that Amal asked, how can a PhD student or an early career researcher be engaged with writing differently? I think it also requires a leap of faith. And also, if we really think there is something that needs to be said, maybe it needs some kind of daring as well to just dare to do it. But again, it's not about saying that you have to have the strength by yourself, because I mean, we're all vulnerable, and writing differently, I think, makes you even more vulnerable, because it can be subject to all forms of critique that are not always very, very helpful or constructive for the writer. However, I think in that sense, building community is very important, and identifying the community of people with whom we can speak, we can share ideas, and we feel we can advance together with constructive dialogue without meaning that there is no critique in that space. And I think it's also important to recognize our differences as writers writing differently, and not just consider that collectivity means we're all the same. I think so in that sense, really making space for embracing differences is important. And again, I mean, it might be a lonely journey as a PhD student, I think, to dare to write differently, because from PhD committees and stuff, you might have a lot of critique and challenges to face. In my experience, I started writing differently and exploring that kind of avenue quite early in my academic career. It's not exactly what I did for my PhD, but it started as a side project on the side of my PhD. And then, I mean, it just took a lot of space in my papers and in my projects. And I mean, I just couldn't think of another way to do research and writing for academia and beyond. I guess it also offered me a space to connect to different languages through which I thought I could express what I was talking about, because it's also maybe a question of how do we speak, as you say, Ilaria. I mean, it's compared to something, but then again, maybe we need particular languages to speak of particular issues like vulnerabilities, inequalities, and maybe writing differently in that sense gives that kind of space to explore, regardless of the space of the stage of career in which we are. So yeah, I think it requires a lot of support. It requires faith at the same time and community to be able to build that kind of support. And also at the same time, I think it requires to have a critical eye in the sense that not only towards the very systems that might constrain us, and so we respond and we resist in a way by writing differently, but also to turn that kind of critical gaze towards ourselves. And always considering, I think that writing is an activity that always places the writer and the reader in a ways that might also create exclusion. So even writing differently might create some forms of exclusion that might be important to consider as writers of writing differently. So yeah, I mean, that was my idea on that. I don't know, if Ilaria, if you would like me to address some questions to you, or maybe open it up to the audience as you wish.
Whatever you prefer, please.
Yeah,
I think, sorry, if just to build on something that you mentioned. So, you know, in a way, like I'm not trying to convert everyone to researching and writing differently. And I think it's absolutely fine for people to decide that this is not for them, you know. So, you know, it's not an imposition on people's way of researching and writing. I think it's an opportunity that many would like to experiment with. And like, for example, in the course I mentioned, where I'm, you know, engaging with the book and some doctoral students, some of them, especially, for example, those from like the arts and humanities, to them, this type of researching and writing is very normal. Like, you know, that is the way most of them do it anyway. But for example, in other types of fields, or like, for example, in legal studies, that jump might be a bit of an extra leap, and especially in terms of the style of writing. But kind of linking with vulnerability and what Amal was saying, there are also some methods, especially for early careers colleagues, but also for colleagues who might be experimenting with researching and writing differently, being particularly aware of that exposure and vulnerabilities. For example, there is collective autoethnography or collective biography, or so by doing this type of research together, there might also be a way of limiting your exposure while still being honest. But also, I think, you know, at the end of the day, people's mental well-being and physical well-being, and, you know, that needs to be the priority. So I think we need to choose ultimately what and how much we want to share. And that's at all career levels, because, you know, it can be a risk when, you know, yes, I know that if I, you know, send something that's written differently to a top journal, you know, that is mainly quantitative or very traditionally qualitative, this is unlikely to get published. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that it's being more and more visible, even through, you know, top level publishing, but it's not a mainstream position. So it's a conscious choice to engage with this. Do we want to see what our colleagues in the audience are asking? Let me see.
Yes, you have quite a lot of questions.
Oh,
so
excellent.
you've got, I think,
Okay.
10 questions and still incoming. So first question might be a bit hard to find, so let me just feed it to you. It's just about asking for a discount code. Lots of people have been asking for the discount code, so which is a great sign. So we've reposted that in chat. And,
thank you. Yes, so it's
also,
it's Research 50, but that is only through the Bristol University Policy Press website. So it's through that link at the website. Sorry.
Important point to qualify, thank you. And also people asking what the slides will be. The slides will be available after.
Yes, very happy to circulate. Yes, thank you.
Okay, and then if you just look in the chat and scroll up, you'll see that the questions are in order. The question 2.
Question 2 was about the marble picture. Yes, so I discovered this in my 20s and I thought it was a little bit like magic. So it's really hard to explain how stereograms work. Basically, there is a picture hidden within that picture. So it might be a horse or, you know, a palm tree or whatever. So you cannot, if you just look at the picture, you cannot see the hidden image. But by distancing yourself and looking at different depth, you know, with your eyes, literally, like engaging in seeing in a different way, you can see the picture, the image behind the picture. It's a bit of a kind of like visual trick. Let me see if we can find a question.
Yeah, the next question, Ilaria, is how does researching and writing differently link to alternative academic career paths? I'm thinking now of the demands of the things like CAPS list.
Very good question, and thank you for joining us today. Yes, so I should say that when I was writing this book and up until then, I have been employed on a contract in the UK that's focused on education and leadership. And so I don't have any requirements or specific requirements around research, even though I do a lot of research. So in a way, different academic careers that are not premised on strict requirements around research, number of outputs, level of outputs, number of citations and rankings and so on, might actually give you more freedom to explore in terms of researching and writing differently, because you are less bound by these requirements of publishing 4 4-star journal articles within 6 years or whatever it might be in your in your professional context. And I think, had I been on a traditional contract, I don't know if I would have had the courage to go there, because it would have been even riskier. But I think at the time when I did my PhD, for example, even autoethnography was like really rare and out of the box. And, after 15 years, it's published in major journals, and it's not, an outrageous thing anymore as it used to be. So I think, probably in a few years' time, researching and writing differently will just be part of how we inhabit academia, hopefully. Let me see the next question, Alex. Can you share a few more thoughts on organizations and communities that include vulnerable members or social groups as a subject of research work, and how it can be approached in a responsible, inclusive manner? So
I think sorry, Larry, I think there were 2 questions before that, I think, by Abru. What advice
sorry, Abru, I didn't see that flagged by Alex. What advice would you give to PhD students who are interested in exploring provocative or unconventional topics with their with their research? How can they overcome potential resistance from academic institutions? So we touched upon this a little bit. There is also an increasing body of work on this, and I hope you'll see some in the in the reference list I have. For example, Writing as Labiaplasty by Alison Pullen is, I think, like a key piece in researching and writing differently. And I think that might speak to your question as well, Ebru. And how do you navigate the fine line between academic rigor and artistic expression in your writing? Do you find challenging to maintain both aspects simultaneously? Yes. So I think, you know, writing differently doesn't mean writing less rigorously. And actually, when we publish, like Emmanouela and Amal and I work together, and, you know, very often as you craft a book or say an article, you need to put in place very conscious ways of thinking about how you implement that rigor. So, you know, it still means, you know, reliability, accountability, in, you know, looking at, you know, the similar but different ways of thinking about research rigor that you would have with qualitative work. But for example, Sam, Warren, Parsley, and Harriet Short have done an amazing job at explaining how to interpret visual materials, you know. So there are ways of looking systematically at how we present and then analyze our work that is more differently presented.
And if I may add one point here, Ilaria, which I totally agree that it doesn't mean that because we write differently, we can do whatever we want. I think also the element of reflexivity, self-reflexivity and other reflexivity might be important in that sense to really ask ourselves the question, I mean, how am I positioned in my context? What do I have to say? Why do I have to say it? As we said before, maybe we don't have to write or to publish a particular on all topics. I mean, maybe we don't need to write differently just for the sake of it. But I mean, if we really feel we have an argument, then maybe asking that question of what do I have to say? What do I learn? And how does it participate to broader debates might as well be one of these questions to answer in making that work more relevant to broader debates in academia, and that's more legitimate in a way.
Yeah, thank
to
you.
Be published.
And I think, for example, I wrote an article with Anke Strauss about foreign women in academia. And although both Anke and I are foreign women in academia, we didn't include any autoethnography or any of our own experience, apart from, like, obviously some reflection on our positionalities. But that study was based on interview material with other colleagues. So, you know, it doesn't have to mean that you are part of every work or in terms of data that you present or you offer. Alex's question, can you share a few more thoughts on organizations and communities that include vulnerable members or social groups as a subject of research work and how it can be approached in a responsible, inclusive manner? Yes, very good question. So I think, and I know Amal and Emmanouela share this view with me, that researching and writing differently is a key way of including people. So this can be done, for example, through co-creation, very explicit participatory co-creation in terms of methods, in terms of data. For example, through, you know, poetry, as I mentioned, or arts-based methods, you know, asking people to take their own photos, or, for example, asking people to approach experience in a different way might be a way of leading through their experience rather than imposing our own academic way of exploring their experience, if you know what I mean. I don't know if Emmanouela and Amal wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think that's, if I may add a reflection on that, I think that's a very important point, because it also shows that, in fact, writing differently is not just an activity that is taking place in the page, but maybe it extends beyond that. I mean, and your book also articulates that point when you're even naming it researching and writing differently, which I guess it also shows, I mean, how can we really engage with the people that are informing our work and that are affected by our work and affect our work in ways that can be inclusive. And again, I mean, I think we shouldn't idealize too much, you know, how inclusive we can be. I think we make an effort, and being reflexive about our ability to be inclusive, I think, is part of the ethics of researching and writing differently. And then again, in my experience, at least, it always involves a big element of surprise. I mean, what does it mean really to be inclusive? I mean, sometimes as a researcher, you might feel excluded from a certain context, and maybe that might be also something to think of. I mean, how can we really engage? So I don't think there is one method to follow. Maybe in my experience, at least, even working with field contexts, you know, involving extreme contexts and vulnerable populations. I mean, I'm always asking myself, like, I mean, what's the way to really engage with the people, you know, to create an inclusive space and also to make people feel comfortable, you know, to let me in, not really going as a researcher that has to go, you know, and study these experiences. So maybe there is also an element of relational reflexivity going on, and also respecting these moments of silence that might be important. Not just because, I mean, as researchers, we want to go and have some testimonies and then have some words to work with, but maybe also respecting the silences of the context which we study might be part of just approaching our work in a different way and engaging with populations in a different way. So maybe listening and respecting silences for me would be an important aspect of researching differently. And
yeah, if I may add another point related to the inclusive and responsible manner. I find that specifically with autoethnography, when we talk about lived experiences, excuse me, it's a little bit tricky because, as the question is trying to say, how can we be responsible, how we consider ethics about not only about ourselves and what we're saying, but about others concerned in our story. And I think this is a very important point. It is a major responsibility. And sometimes as academics or as writers, we start to think and rethink about how what we're writing, what we are disclosing, how in disclosing the specific experience, we have to be very responsible of not harming others, not disclosing like delicate incidents or any identifiable characteristics of the people that we're talking about. And I think this takes a big courage and responsibility for us as people who write in autoethnography to consider.
Thank you. The next question by Rafia is about recommendations of other online platforms similar to CMS in Touch and Vida CMS Facebook group for online inspiration and support. And maybe our audience can put some of the suggestions in the chat so we can all share our communities of support. Next question, hi Nela. Thank you, that's very kind. Can you tell us a bit more about the emancipatory potential of writing differently and whether this is something exclusive to academia, or can we observe writing differently as a broader political project? Perhaps you can share some effective examples of such work from other spheres of life. Oh, that's a wonderful question. And I think, yes, so one of the, this is just like a personal opinion, but I find the work of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg an example of writing differently. So the way she wrote her, you know, like legal challenges in the United States was an example of writing differently, and something that obviously is not academic, you know, this is like, you know, a legal, you know, court. But is the way it was done, the language it used, to me, was a prime example of researching and writing differently that was, you know, inspired by social justice and inspired in return social justice. So that to me was a great example. And I think in my experience, I have never received as, you know, wonderful, but also like really engaged feedback with my work as when I do things that are like researching and writing differently. Because I think it resonates, the personal experience resonates with the universal experience. And so, you know, people across, you know, disciplines or, you know, people across the world, different contexts. And I think it is because it has that kind of resonance that goes beyond the academic experience. And I don't know if Emmanouela and Amal wanted to add in terms of other examples, for example.
Yeah, actually, I was reading recently a book because I was doing field work in an artists and writers community in Barcelona, which was actually a space that really gave a lot of opportunities for exchanging inspiration with other forms of writing. And there were writers of all kinds, like novelists and poets and film writers and script writers and other types. And we were exchanging inspirations, and there I was actually able to identify some really nice examples of writing differently, which are not necessarily specific to academia. For instance, there was a book called Performing Mourning by Guy Cools, where he's describing how art, actually, and performing art can be a way of mourning and can be a way of expressing experiences that are really very harmful, as in a way to find avenues towards healing. And this particular book, for instance, came at really a very good moment because I was really working on a paper on writing and reading as healing processes, and it provided me with a lot of perspectives which I felt could also be integrated in my academic work to reflect even more on the experiences talked about in that paper. And also, I mean, it revealed to me how art and performative arts and the body put in a particular place in time and performing that kind of pain can be a beautiful way to engage with, to find different words to express certain forms of certain experiences that we go through. So yeah, I think in arts we might find some beautiful examples of autoethnographies that might inspire academic work.
Yeah, thank you, Emmanouela and Ilaria. I think in my experience, I found it in a completely different kind of books. It's an Arabic book, and it details the sociology aspect and the psychological aspect of a collection of women's lived experiences about sexual violence. And I really loved how the stories were weaved together, and how all the voices were accounted for, how it was contextualized. It was a totally different kind of writing differently that we're used to here. It's even different from the Arabic writing style in Egypt, because it was produced in Egypt. And I found it really helpful, and it really inspired me. How can I do the same with my data collection, my interviews as well? So yeah, it was a really good example from sociology and psychology. I think the next question, Ilaria, is if you can share your thoughts on the crucial. Oh, that's a very good question. I would love to hear this as well of reviewers and senior editors that supporting scholars who choose to write differently.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. As an author, a reviewer, and an editor, I think this is a really, really important question. And I, as I hinted at before, I know that, reviewing and editing and those choices are not neutral and they're not objective. And, I have the pleasure of being the co-editor-in-chief of a journal called Culture and Organization with the wonderful Christine Williams. And I think that is also connected to kind of like caring aspects. So, you can embody your role as reviewer and editor in many different ways. As an editor, I would not send a written differently paper to someone who, completely rejects that. And I, as an author, I have been asked, I sent a paper and someone said, you've got interviews and autoethnography, it's not enough. Where is your quantitative data collection? And it's like, well, that's not what the paper is about. So, if you find reviewers who just don't espouse the approach or don't get the paper, this is like any type of writing, but even more so in researching and writing differently, because it can be really quite outside of the box, then that is a major, gatekeeping event, both for reviewers and in terms of editors. And I think editors, kind of like main editors, have the responsibility to select an associate editor to take care of a paper, and the associate editor has the responsibility to really think about who the best people are for the paper, not necessarily meaning that we have to only engage people who speak the same language we speak, or that who have the same approach. That's not the point. The point is that, you know, we need to assess the papers in the paper we're reading, not the paper that we want to write, you know, which is very often an issue for reviewers. And I think, you know, making sure that as an editor, you set the tone for, you know, for example, in my journal, Christine and I really highlighted that we want to have a developmental approach. We want to have a caring approach. So, for example, you know, in our special issues, we don't want to just say there are 4 spaces in the special issue or 5. And if your paper is great, but it doesn't make your special issue, then it's rejected. That's not what we want for our journal. So we can have double special issues. We can redirect papers to the general issue. But also, for example, instead of having call for papers that, you know, are like a one-off, make it or break it, send us a full article by X date, we have developmental workshops where we talk to authors, we help them develop their theoretical frameworks, we, you know, help them interrogate the nuances of their data. So that's what I meant about like caring approaches as well, you know, thinking not in this kind of like dichotomous successful, unsuccessful, competitive way, but, you know, how can we work together to, you know, to create enabling environments that, you know, might not be safe for everyone, but at least are, you know, enabling and caring as much as we can. And I don't know if you, Amal, for example, in your experience of publishing, I mean, as an author, it's made a huge difference to me. Had I had horrible reviewers for that paper I wrote, you know, for the management learning special issue, I would have probably been scared off writing differently for life. So it can make a huge difference.
Yes, indeed. I think from my experience so far, I think I would say I've been so lucky so far with the comments and the reviewers' comments that I received, very caring. And I think there is a very big factor here, is the journal. Are you speaking the same voice? Are you submitting the paper to the same space that you would join an ongoing conversation? Because they will ensure that this is being reviewed by the right people who would understand what you're saying. If they prioritize care, as you said, in culture and organization as a journal, the selection of the reviewer will align with such a vision. So I think so far there has been some tricky reviews, but I think sometimes it's also helpful to be challenged and to rethink, am I delivering the message to broader audience, as Emmanouela talked about earlier? Am I ensuring that everything is accounted for? So yeah, I think so far my experiences, I would say positive, but it depends on if I'm submitting the paper to the right journal or the right special issue, for example.
Thank you. And just, for example, to give some other journals, like Alison and Bano have done an incredible job in gender work and organization, like really opened up the door to this, you know, management learning, as we said, organization, you know, more qualitative inquiry type of journals, QROM for methods. So there are a lot more and more journals every day, I think, that really are embracing this approach. And just to address Vinicius's question, you know, some people have built an academic career on researching and writing differently. So, you know, it has its risks, but, you know, it's increasingly popular and it's increasingly visible as well. Sorry, Manuel.
Oh, yeah, no, great. Yeah, totally. I mean, I totally agree with you that there are different parts, and thanks, Shahrazad, for asking that question, actually, because there are different ways of thinking of writing differently. And I mean, what does it mean to review papers in a different way, to edit papers in a different way? So also reviewing differently, which means reading differently and editing differently. And then how can this actually really help to give the author some constructive comments to work with their ideas, which again this doesn't necessarily mean that the comments are going to be easy or just like everything, I think being challenged is part of developing even further that reflexivity as authors and understanding it as a relational process with reviewers and editors. And I think it's not an easy work to do. It requires a lot of care. It requires a lot of emotional labor at the same time. For instance, it's been now almost 2 years, a year and a half, that I have the big privilege to be co-editing the Feminist Frontier section of Gender Work and Organization with Alice Wickstrom. And it's been really a beautiful learning process, not an easy one, a quite challenging process at the same time, to really how can we create that space and engage with authors, with reviewers, and with other editors of the journal to really create that kind of caring space where different voices can be heard. And I think as an editor is also, as you said, Ilaria, to really know whom to send the paper for review. And also a way to do it differently, in my experience, might even be to engage in that reviewing and editing process more early career researchers, new voices. I mean, people that we haven't necessarily read much of their work because it's just a question of time. I mean, we all need to be given opportunities and resources to be able to publish, but I think through editing and reviewing might also be a way to bring new voices in that academic sphere, also as an act of learning together and of caring together between us and with authors. So I think there's a different approach to the very normative approach to editing and reviewing that is important to embrace.
Absolutely.
In my experience, yeah.
And I think some journals like Cultural Organization do that consciously, of inviting reviewers from more established and less established colleagues, of, opening up positions on editorial boards for early career colleagues, encouraging some as well. The next question is about begging the question different from what, how, and why. So I think I've covered this quite a lot in the earlier stages of the presentation in terms of different from what. Rafi was also asking journals which you believe are friendly towards, we've just mentioned some, but as you say, Rafi, definitely the bibliography will give you a good idea of where these conversations are happening. And I think as an editor, it's really important that when we write an article, any article, doesn't need to be written differently, we are very aware of the conversations we contribute to. So it's important to, make a conscious effort to finding out where those conversations are happening in which journals. Do we need to think how to review differently? Oh, yes. So Kristen and I have been discussing this quite a lot, and we will be trialing a form of open reviewing and publishing some of the reviews within a special issue. So I think there is definitely lots to be considered. And I think I know of people who seem very lovely and very, caring feminist supporters of researching and writing differently, who behind the closed doors of, the reviewer's chair are actually, quite vicious. So I think it's maybe more open conversations that are also quite mindful of the impact that a review can have mentally on someone, emotionally on someone, on career-wise, on a promotion or lack thereof. I think it's really important to rethink how we can do reviewing differently. Dilek is asking, I think the pressure to publish or perish is killing researchers' creativity and or motivation to think and write differently. Good work requires time. Yes. How do we negotiate with management about quality versus quantity? This is like $1 million question. And I do really appreciate, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the Slow Professor, or I talk about slow reading, slow researching. And it's really tricky for me. So, I think as a mom of 2 kids under 6 and, someone who has like a big admin leadership job and, not a lot of time, I do feel the pressure of time. And I don't know if Amal, you wanted to provide some reflections on this, because I know it's a challenge, especially for early career colleagues. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's very tricky, especially how competitive it is in the UK, and whether if cycle and how it works and how hiring and recruiting academics and all the divisions about education role versus research and education versus research only. I think there are lots of factors and variables to consider. Although I really hate the word variables, very quantitative for a qualitative researcher, but there are lots of factors to consider, and I think this is specifically so for people who are PhD students, like I was last year, and early career researchers. It feels like you're chasing your tail, as they say, or it's an endless open-ended maze. So yeah, I do feel the pressure of publishing, especially after finishing my PhD and being in my very first academic job in the UK. There is always expectations, high expectations, not only of the ranking of the journal, whether it's 3 or 4 stars, but also how many authors you have, where are they located, who are citing you, in which journal they are citing you, and whether it's autoethnography. This is not quite the research we expect you to do. So there are lots of factors that even put more pressure on you as an early career researcher. How this affects your promotion, how this affects you advancing in the career. So lots of pressure.
Thank you, Amal. I think we also need to acknowledge that there are different academic careers. So there are academic careers that are not bound by these very strict, norms. There are also different universities. So we can, to a certain extent, and we can't always choose because we have to pay the bills, but sometimes we can choose whether it's at the beginning or a later stage of our career to, for example, focus on a university that, requires top ranking and excellence in everything, or universities that allow us more flexibility in how and what we research. Also, some European countries or other countries, as long as you publish, in a well-established international peer-reviewed kind of like environment, it doesn't follow the same rules that we have super strict in the UK. And I think maybe Emmanouela, you can talk a little bit to that, because I think, your work, you publish differently a lot, and I don't think you have the same rigid system. Your work.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that it's not exactly the same with the UK system, and I guess, different countries have different norms and systems around that. I mean, the French context is usually a bit more open to critical perspectives and different kinds of perspectives. But again, I think it's getting a bit more stringent lately. But at the same time, I think that when it comes to the question of DLEC, how can we negotiate with management? I think it's never an easy negotiation to have, but I think that also in our roles as people that are getting more and more administrative positions, leadership positions, maybe it's also on us to try to rethink some of the requirements, because requirements are not there alone. They don't exist alone. They're not decided alone. They're decided by human beings at the same time. And I think in our role as people that like to do academia differently, we might as well start rethinking how some of these requirements are actually applied in the context where we work, if we want to engage with the plurality of perspectives in the academic knowledge that we create. So I'm not saying that's an easy negotiation, but it requires a lot of labor and emotional labor at the same time. But I think it's important, if we want really to create a plural space in academia, to think what can we do to bring in different perspectives. What would that mean in terms of rethinking the requirements of publications, etc. Yeah, so maybe in our roles also as coordinators, leaders of different research groups or programs, or we might want to think what is, instead of just accepting that I have to follow that directive, how can I engage with maybe creatively reconfiguring that directive? Again, that takes time. I think it doesn't happen overnight, but maybe it's worth the effort if we want to think academia differently, more broadly. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, and I will use my privilege, if you don't mind, in just going with the next one in the list. Sorry for the other questions that we weren't able to address today, and thank you for engaging so well with this conversation. Jane asks, oh, that's a wonderful question. As a copy editor, I'm conscious that I edit writing differently. That is, I'm particularly attentive to narrative voice. Do you have your work copy edited, and if so, what are your issues and concerns when you place your writing in another's hands? So wonderful question, and I have to say I had the privilege of having a wonderful copy editor for the book. So once I sent in my final manuscript, then I worked with the copy editor, and it was really interesting because he said it's one of the most enjoyable jobs he had, because it's so different, and it really made him think about how he relates to the writing, to the ethos, and we had wonderful exchanges. It was such a collaborative process, you know. It wasn't just like sending proofs back and forth. It was such a collaborative process, and I think it needs to be that engaged discussion, because, you know, he was saying, I think you're saying this, but that doesn't work with, like, your poetic language doesn't work like this. So, you know, and then we had, you know, I have pet peeve with Latin, and because I did classics in high school, so I'm very protective of my Latin. And then we talked about other things. So I think, again, with, you know, the other processes that very often are considered, you know, extra to the writing, like, you know, citing, like how to write, you know, the reference list so that people's identities are there and they're not, you know, gender, for example, is not hidden, how to cite, how to use data, how copy editing, reviewing, editing, it's part of that bigger conversation about researching differently, that is not just strictly about the writing. So thank you so much. And I think this is all the time we've got for today, Alex.
Wow, thank you so much, Ilaria, Emmanouela, Amal. That has just been incredible discussion and conversation. And thank you also so much for writing that book in the first place, and for choosing to launch it with CMS in Touch. I mean, like, I don't think I'd still be an academic if I didn't have the option of writing, researching, and doing academia differently. I think we tend to focus on the difficulties of doing things differently, don't we? Because there's these conventions and mainstream, and but actually sometimes I think for some people it's actually can be easier and more liberating to write and research differently, because it feels such a straitjacket to be imposed those conventions otherwise. So thank you very much for actually highlighting this as a possibility, right? And not just a possibility, but a viable alternative. So thank you. It's really, really wonderful. And I really feel like I also found my tribe. So it's brilliant. Thank you all so much. So onto our kind of forthcoming events. If you enjoyed this, and maybe Olga, you can bring up the closing slide. Thank you. If you've enjoyed this conversation on researching and writing differently, then you'll probably enjoy our next event, which is on doing academic careers differently. And it plays right into the hands of those who are asking about, well, how do we then do our academic careers differently? Is it possible to do academic careers in such a way that enables this sort of forms of writing and thinking? So we hope to see you on the 28th of July, and it's actually the launch of an edited book by Sarah Robinson, myself, and Olivier Rattle, who was also, I noticed, here today. Hello, Olivier. And yeah, so we'll hope to see you and continue this discussion. And in the meantime, check us out. We are on Twitter. We are on Eventbrite. You can contact us by email if you have ideas for forthcoming events. So CMS in Touch is very much a community project, and we would like to reflect the interests of the community. So if you have any ideas for the sort of events you'd like to see, please let us know. It's a very democratic institution. And also, we have our own YouTube channel where you can check out recordings of all past events. The recording of this event will also be on YouTube channel, so you can catch up if you couldn't make all of it or at all. Also, we do have some relevant series there that are also relevant to discussion we had today. So for example, the question on which journals are supportive of this sort of work, we have a special series on publishing critical work in which we've run so far 14 PDWs with editors of journals receptive to critical work. So you might want to check them out and see what sort of places are receptive. And with this, I'd like to say a final thank you to Ilaria, Amal, and Emmanouela. Thank you very much for being with us today. And also to CMS in Touch team. Behind the scenes, you cannot see our hardworking elves, but Olga and Muniba here piloting Zoom, making sure it all works technically. And Richard Longman is live tweeting as well in the background. So thank you very much, CMS in Touch. Thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you.
We'll see you.
Thank you very much as well for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
well. Thank you.
And thank
all.
you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. Bye for now.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.